Hey guys, Endless here, welcome back to the channel. This is part 3 to What If Deku is Cursed Speech. Also check out the other videos on my playlists. Before I start this story, do you guys like the pacing or is it too slow? Either way, I hope you guys enjoy. It's been a week since the entrance exams and Izuku was wondering how much longer it would take for him to get his letter of acceptance. He is just laying on his bed staring at the ceiling. As he was thinking about how it would be like at UA, he heard his mother yell his name frantically. Izuku, being curious, gets off his bed and walks over to his door and opens it. "Mustard leaf?" he shouted back. "Your letter from UA is here," she yelled from the living room. Hearing this, Izuku grinned and walked over towards her. Once he was beside her, Izuku grabbed the letter and sat down on the couch. Staring at his mother, he patted the seat next to him and she smiled and joined her son. Then Izuku stared at the envelope in his hand, then quickly opened it. Once he opened said letter, something fell out and landed onto the small table that was in front of them. Izuku and Inko looked at each other, both looking confused, but that's when a hologram appeared above the small disc. An All Might appeared within said hologram, and that's when he spoke. "Izuku Midoriya, I am here to tell you how you did during your exams for UA." The number one hero then went a little closer towards the camera a bit, and grinned. "I hope the training Gran Torino gave you and young Bakugou was worthwhile." Hearing that man's name, Izuku started to sweat, all the while shaking a bit. Remembering the torture, training. Inko just looked at her son confused, but that's when All Might spoke up once again. "Well, young Midoriya, you passed the written exam with only missing 5 questions, and on the practical, you got 70 villain points, and there was a secret part of the exam which ended up giving you 25 hero points for getting all the applicants out of the way from the 0-pointer, so this puts your score at 95, which puts you at 2nd place. After hearing this, Izuku wondered if Katsuki got first, and not a moment later All Might showed a chart for the top 10 applicants. And just as he thought, Bakugou got 98 villain points and 0 hero points. Izuku just chuckled, and as if on cue his phone went off in his room. Inko hugged her son and spoke. "I'm glad for you, son. Being a hero was always your dream," she said with a soft smile. Izuku just nodded and hugged her back. He then got up and muttered, "Bonito flakes." Inko just smiled and watched as the green-haired boy went into his room. Izuku walked over to his phone and looked at who was calling him. It was Katsuki. The green-haired boy answered and put the phone to his ear, but immediately after moved it to the side, with Bakugou laughing at him. "Oi, I told you that you were going to get second." Hearing this, Izuku's eyebrow twitched, he growled and shouted back, "Caviar, tuna." Once the blonde heard that, he just laughed some more and Izuku just muttered caviar once again. Katsuki stopped laughing and spoke, "Well, I'll see you tomorrow in class," and with that he hung up. As Izuku was about to put his phone away, he got another call from his girlfriend. Said boy answered the phone and put it on speaker. "So were you able to get in Aizu?" Izuku had threw his phone on his bed and started to get ready, wanting to get some last-minute training in. But he replied nonetheless, "Salmon." "Ah, I see, that's good, I got into class 1B. Izuku walked over to his phone and spoke once again while zipping up his high-collared black and red sweater. "Tuna, salmon roe, salmon." Yui just giggled a bit. She is able to understand him, but said girl finds the way he talks cute. She then replied, "Okay, I will see you tomorrow at school." Izuku raised a curious brow at her giggling at him, but spoke, "Salmon," and with that he hung up. Quickly making his way out of his room, he sent a quick text to Bakugou if he wants to do some last-minute training. He then made his way towards the door and waved bye to his mother. "Tuna, tuna." Hearing this, Inko glanced at her son and replied, "All right, be careful." Izuku just nodded and Inko went back to watching the TV. Putting his shoes on, Izuku walked over to the door and grabbed his house keys and left his apartment. As he was leaving, his phone buzzed. Quickly pulling out his phone, the green-haired boy saw that Katsuki had responded with, "I'll be there in 5. He then sent another text, "I want to check out this beach called Dagoba Beach." The green-haired boy raised an eyebrow and responded, "The garbage dump?" "Yes, now stop texting me, I need to get ready." And with that, Izuku put his phone away while shaking his head. 5 minutes later. Izuku was standing near a light post waiting for the ash blonde to come. Looking around he noticed said blonde and waited for him. Once Katsuki was standing in front of Izuku he held out his fist with a smirk and Izuku mirrored said smirk and bumped fist with Bakugou. "So you ready to go? I want to try and clean it up after school and stuff." Izuku raised an eyebrow and questioned, "Tuna mayo?" Katsuki just laughed a bit and walked inside of the train station. As the duo were waiting for a train Bakugou spoke. "Think of this as side training or something. I want to get stronger." As he says this the blonde looked at the scar on his forearm. Izuku just nodded remembering the villain the two faced. Well, if he was being honest she didn't seem like one. But people have their problems he thought. As the two were contemplating the train arrived and the duo quickly walked in and grabbed a seat near the back. Bakugou looked around and back at Izuku. "Well, we will just be there for an hour to see how much trash is there. And tomorrow we can start clearing it out, or even some today." The green-haired boy nodded while saying salmon. Katsuki just grinned and the two waited to reach their stop. 10 minutes later the two made their way out of the train station and headed towards the beach. Izuku checked his pockets for something and muttered, "Tuna." After not feeling it Izuku gasped and checked his remaining pockets. Then he remembered, Izuku left his trusty cough syrup at his house. Izuku deflated and had storm clouds over his head. Katsuki glanced at his green-haired friend and wondered where the clouds came from. Quickly brushing it off he spoke, "Well, we are here." He then glanced back at Izuku and the clouds were still there, with Izuku sulking under said clouds. Bakugou sighed and walked up to Izuku. "What's wrong? Did you forget something?" Izuku glanced up after hearing Bakugou speak. He just nodded and pointed at his throat. Bakugou laughed a bit which earned him a glare from the green-haired boy. "Why don't you just buy a replacement for now?" Izuku brightened up after hearing that and looked around for a store. Spotting one the green-haired boy ran inside, while Katsuki just shook his head, with him thinking how does he forget that he can just buy more at stores. The blonde then stood in front of the store waiting for his friend, but he didn't notice a scream in the distance. About a minute later the green-haired boy walked out of the store holding a small bottle of cough syrup. Katsuki just sighed and made his way towards the beach with Izuku following. Once the duo made it to the beach, Katsuki realized that something was off. He glanced at Izuku, who was getting the same feeling as the blonde. The two nodded and tensed when they heard someone screaming while running away from something. Both of them thinking that this seemed oddly familiar. Bakugou used his quirk and flew up into the air looking around to see what was happening. Izuku pulled down his collar and spoke, "Foothold." This is a move Izuku was working on, but he still can't completely do it. Essentially, he can make a small foothold on air which is the size of a dinner plate. He is only able to use this move 10 times before he loses control. But with that Izuku jumped onto the small transparent foothold and jumped up to another. He can put these to whatever is in his range of sight. With Bakugou he glanced around mid-air and quickly spotted a man with blue flames coming out his hands chasing another one through the beach. Glancing to his side he noticed Izuku standing right next to him. Looking back at the person who was running he then spun his head back towards Izuku so fast, said boy thought if he got whiplashed. Katsuki just muttered, "I'll ask later." During their training they usually trained in different areas of the forest, so that's why Bakugou didn't know about this move. But quickly remembering there was someone running for their life, Katsuki launched himself down with an explosion and aimed one at the guy with ripped skin on his face. Wait, ripped skin, he thought. Either way he launched an explosion at the man who noticed it and jumped away from the crook that he wanted to kill. The man growled and both of his hands lit up in blue flames. "You have a lot of guts, kid, I'll give you that." After he said those words the man launched his flames forward towards the ash blonde, but he noticed the kid didn't try to dodge nor block. But that's when he heard a shout behind the boy. He glanced behind the blonde and noticed a boy with green hair, who shouted disperse towards the flames. And with that the blue flames parted in 2 different directions around Bakugou. Said boy being unaffected by the flames, he then rushed at the man once again being boosted by explosions. Seeing this Izuku shouted accelerate and body enhancement. The blonde grinned once he heard this and his speed tripled. Appearing in front of the bewildered villain he launched a roundhouse kick with an explosion boosting it at the man's head. who was barely able to put his guard up, but he ended up getting launched towards a refrigerator. Once he made contact with said refrigerator, the man went through it and crashed into another pile of trash. Katsuki, being on guard, stared at where the man crash landed. He didn't notice the other guy's grin. Hearing the gun click, he was about to shoot Bakugou, but before he did, the man spoke, "Thanks for the save, kid, here's my appreciation." But as he was going to pull the trigger, Izuku shouted, "Get twisted," and the man's arm twisted and quickly snapped, which ended up with the gun dropping on the floor harmlessly. Katsuki gave a grateful nod to Izuku, who kicked the gun away and chopped the man's neck, finding his pain screams annoying. But that's when the two boys noticed the temperature go up. Quickly dodging to the side, they were able to narrowly dodge two streams of blue flames. Once they landed, that's when the man spoke up. "You know, I was just going to kill that guy over there, but you two really ticked me off." As he says this, his whole body lit up in flames. "Remember this, brats, for this is the last name you'll hear before you die." Both of the boys just looked at each other confused, wondering why this guy was so sure that they were going to be killed. "My name is Dabi, and now burn in hell," and with it he launched flames towards the two boys once again. Katsuki flew up into the air while Izuku shouted, "Redirect." And the flames that were sent towards Izuku got sent back towards the now revealed Dabi, whose eyes were wide at the sight of his flames getting turned on him like that. Quickly cancelling his quirk, he jumped away, not really wanting to get burned by his own flames. That already happens enough, Dabi thought, but as he dodged, Katsuki launched small explosions at the villain from above. Quickly dodging the boys' attacks, he noticed how easily the explosions pierced the things that were around him. That's when he heard footsteps coming towards him. Looking up ahead, he saw the green-haired boy running towards him. Not wanting to get attacked by two different sides, he quickly put his arms up and launched flames towards Izuku, who shouted, "Disperse," and the flames passed by him harmlessly. Dabi, being confused, wondered why his flames weren't working on this brat. That's when he got a punch on the side of his face, which sent him flying. He's strong, he thought. Quickly catching himself, Dabi grinned at the two in front of him, who were panting due to the flames around them. They were both trying their best not to inhale any of the smoke, but were failing. Dabi noticed this, smirked, and put his hands together with one over the other. He then shouted, "This was fun, but this is the end." Dabi launched his flames not towards the duo, but towards the ground. Izuku, seeing this shout, stopped and tried to contain the flames, but wasn't able to. Bakugou, seeing this, propels himself with an explosion towards Izuku and tackled him towards the water. Boom! The flames shook the entire beach, and the two boys were now underwater in the ocean. When the two came up for air, they looked on at the beach in shock. Half of it was burning along with, "Oh crap," Bakugou muttered. Izuku raised an eyebrow, then looked over where Bakugou pointed at. There in the fire, the man that they tried to save was nothing more than ashes that flew into the wind. Izuku's eyes went white, thinking he indirectly killed someone. He looked down at his hands and was about to fall under the water. But that's when Katsuki grabbed him and Katsuki smacked him on the side of the face. Now being shocked, Izuku looked up at Bakugou, who was staring at him with an intense gaze. "It wasn't your fault," he shouted angrily. "You didn't know that Dabi guy was going to launch an all-out flame attack." He then smiled, "Either way, you only knocked him out because he tried to kill me." As he said this, Katsuki swam over to the shore with Izuku following shortly after, still contemplating what just happened. The two heard sirens in the distance, and both of them quickly ran towards the other side of the beach, both of them not really wanting to deal with police officers once again. Both of the boys separate after reaching their blocks, and as Izuku walked into his home, the green-haired boy noticed his mother was watching the news. It was about the random fire at Dagoba Beach. She glanced at her son once she saw him enter and noticed the burn marks on his face and clothes. Inko then glared at her son, who in his defense put his hands up cautiously. Tuna? He said worriedly. However, Inko just growled and marched towards him. 5 minutes later, Inko was wrapping Izuku up as a mummy again, and said boy now had a big bump on the side of his head. She then spoke, "So you're saying a man tried to burn another man alive at the beach, and you?" Plus Katsuki tried to stop said man from doing so. Izuku just nodded while rubbing his throat. He brought out his cough syrup and finished it all in one gulp. Sighing, he looked over back at his mother, who was now giving him a stern glare. The green-haired boy gulped again. And Inko just sighed. I swear whenever you go out to train something bad happens. Just go to your room. Izuku nodded and quickly made his way to his room. But before he walked inside, his mother shouted, "Oh, and you're grounded for a month. You can't go training with Katsuki in that time." Izuku sighed and nodded weakly. He then glanced at his phone and was about to hand it over, but Inko just smiled and shook her head. "I know your girlfriend calls you and I want grandbabies, so I'll let you keep your phone." Hearing this, Izuku's face went beet red. He quickly ran inside his room and shut the door. Inko just giggled after seeing that reaction, but she then looked back towards the TV. I'm just glad he didn't get seriously hurt. Now we skip to the next day. Izuku and Katsuki made their way up the stairs of UA, and Katsuki smirked while Izuku still looked sad from what happened yesterday. Bakugou glanced at his friend and just sighed. You don't need to beat yourself over what happened, like I said, it wasn't your fault. Izuku just muttered salmon. Both boys then quickly made their way inside the building, and Izuku noticed Yui talking to an orange-haired girl. Izuku walked up to the two with Bakugou telling Izuku he will be in class. The green-haired boy just nodded. Yui heard footsteps coming towards her. She glanced at her side and smiled once she saw Izuku. Quickly running up to the green-haired boy, she jumped and gave him a bear hug. Said boy caught the girl and returned the hug. Yui then pulled down Izuku's mask and gave him a quick kiss. She was about to speak, but that's when she heard a cough behind her. Izuku glanced behind Yui and noticed the orange-haired girl walking towards them. Yui turned around and blushed, and Izuku just gave a curious look to the new girl, who was now standing in front of the couple, and smiled. So I take it you're her boyfriend? Izuku just nodded, which the orange-haired girl smiled. My name is Itsuka Kendo, I'm Yui's best friend. She then grinned. You know, she talks about you a lot. Izuku looked at Yui, who was now if possible even more red than before. Kendo noticed this and continued, yes, she said that how you saved her was. But she got cut off by the black-haired girl who yelled Itsuka. Said girl just smiled and started to walk away. Now I'll leave you two lovebirds alone, I'll be in class. Yui just stared at the floor, still blushing, but Izuku grabbed her hand and squeezed it a bit. She then looked up towards him and noticed his sad expression. Yui tilted her head and asked if he is still sad about what happened. Izuku had told her over text about the fight and the person he let die. She had told him it wasn't his fault, but Izuku was still sad about it. Yui hugged him and got him to look at her. She smiled at him and asked if he wanted to go to the movies to cheer him up. She then said, I think they serve ramen there too. Izuku smiled softly behind his mask and just nodded. Once Yui saw this, she raised her arms up in victory and grabbed his hand, leading him to their class. Their classes were right next to one another. But the two didn't notice Katsuki watching them in the corner. He smirked and thought she is good for him. He then made his way towards class 1A right after them. Once the two were in front of their classroom, Yui gave Izuku a kiss on his cheek and said see you at lunch. She then walked inside her class with Izuku holding his cheek, but that's when he heard boo right behind him. Izuku jumped and quickly turned around and launched a punch at whoever snuck up on him. Katsuki chuckled and dodged said punch, and laughed at Izuku's flustered face. Bakugou was always able to sneak up on him and scare the green-haired boy. Said boy just glared at his friend, who waved away his glare and walked past him. He kicked the door open and everyone inside stared at him in shock. In response, the blonde raised a brow and asked, what, never seen anyone kick a door before? Izuku just sighed and smacked the blonde on the back of his head, who growled and was about to attack, but that's when Izuku noticed a yellow caterpillar behind Bakugou. Said boy noticed Izuku's surprised face and turned around. Seeing the yellow thing, Katsuki jumped back and threw his backpack at the caterpillar-looking thing. Bakugou hates bugs in this story, lol. Anyways, once the bag hit the yellow thing, it fell down and Katsuki heard it growl, quickly readying an explosion, but that's when Izuku put his hand over Bakugou's shoulder. The yellow thing had a zipper and it got pulled down. Walking out, a man with long dark hair came out of it. And he glared at Bakugou, all the while throwing the bag back at him. Said boy not expecting it got sent flying out of the door. sending Izuku out with him, because the green-haired boy was standing behind him. Aizawa, seeing he got a double kill, quickly looked at his students and spoke with a growl. "My name is Shota Aizawa, I'm your teacher, now put this on now." He showed them P.E uniforms and left them on his desk. Said teacher then walked outside and dragged the two boys to the changing room, who were both unconscious from the impact. All the while the two had gym uniforms on top of them. He left the two brats inside of the changing room and walked away, going towards the testing area outside. About 2 minutes later the two regained consciousness, and that's when the door opened. Walking in, a red-haired boy looked at the two that were slowly getting up. One was shouting curse words and the other boy was glaring daggers at the blonde. The guy rubbed the back of his head and chuckled nervously. Which once he did, the two boys in front of him glared at him. That made the red-haired boy gulp. "Well, I'm Kirishima, it's nice to meet you." Bakugou sighed and rubbed the back of his head. "I'm Katsuki Bakugou and this is Izuku Midoriya." Said boy waved his hand at the redhead. Before he could ask why he didn't speak, other boys walked in as well. Seeing this, Izuku and Katsuki walked over to their lockers and noticed both of theirs were next to one another. As the two were changing, that's when they noticed a purple-haired midget trying to get everyone's attention. All of the boys looked at him, then he spoke. "Look, the people before us left us a gift." As he says this, Mineta pulled up the poster and there was a small hole, with the girls' changing room being on the other side. Lita then raised his hand up robotically, saying that isn't heroic. However, the smaller boy didn't care and was about to peek when he saw something coming towards his eye. Then it made contact, which made the boy scream in pain. On the other side, Jairu pulled out her jack and glared at the hole, with some girls looking on in worry. Anyways, 3 minutes later, Class 1A was now standing in front of Aizawa, who was still glaring at Bakugou and now his accomplice, the green-haired one. He sighed and held out a ball. "You blonde brat, go throw this in that circle over there with your quirk." Aizawa then threw the ball at Katsuki and said boy walked over to the center of said circle. All the while stretching, he looked back at Izuku and smirked. "Why don't you try and beat this?" He looked over at Aizawa and asked, "I could do whatever as long as I'm in the circle, right?" Aizawa just nodded and Izuku sighed while shaking his head. His friend likes to show off. Once Bakugou heard this, he grinned and walked to the edge of the circle. He got into a stance and held the ball in a reverse grip. Katsuki with his other arm launched an explosion and spun about 2 times, then yelled, "Howitzer impact!" And he sent the ball in the air with a loud boom. It cracked the floor around him and left a smoldering trail from where he threw the ball. All of the students stared at him in shock, and that's when Aizawa heard a beep on his phone. Glancing at it, he showed everyone his score. "Now you're all training to be heroes, so give it your best, that's what we mean about Plus Ultra." He then gave them all a scary glare with his quirk activated. "Last one is getting expelled." Katsuki stared at his score. It was 3,015 meters away. Bakugou walked over to his friend and thought, if I got more spins probably could have launched it twice that amount. So the remaining test went like as in canon, and Izuku was able to place in top 3 on most of them. But on 2 of them he got first place, like in the grip strength he just muttered shatter and it broke. And on the long jump he tied with Bakugou, he used his foothold and used that to reach the other side. Everyone was surprised he could do that, even Aizawa looked impressed. Then it was now Izuku's turn for the throw. Izuku looked over at Bakugou and spoke. "Tuna, tuna," he said enthusiastically. Bakugou doesn't know why, but he didn't like how confident his friend sounded. Izuku caught the ball Aizawa threw at him and said, "You're the last one up." Midoriya just grinned and walked towards the center of the circle. He looked at the ball in his hand, then pulled down his mask with his other hand and spoke out loud so Bakugou could hear. "Zero gravity," said Blonde shouted. "OHH, that's bull sh." But he quickly got smacked by Aizawa's scarf, all the while shouting language. Izuku then threw the ball into the air, and once it floated away a bit he shouted, "Blast away." Since the ball didn't have gravity, it got launched towards the sky, leaving a star in its place. Aizawa looked at his screen and grinned, showing an infinity symbol just like what happened with Achiko. But his was green. He then told everyone to line up in front of him, and Aizawa noticed Bakugou's muttering in Izuku's amused face. Aizawa sighed and knew he wasn't going to like those two problem brats. He then showed everyone their score, and I'm just going to say top 5. First was tied by Izuku and Katsuki. Second is Momo Yaoyorozu. Third is Todoroki Shoto. Fourth is Tenya Lita. Fifth is Fumikichi Tokoyami. Oh, and last is Minoru Mineta. But before Mineta could cry, Aizawa spoke up. Oh, and I lied about expelling one of you guys. Now get changed again and meet me inside class. Everyone was shocked and Momo spoke up. What, you guys didn't think he was serious, right? Hearing this, Katsuki and Izuku just walked away towards the changing room with the redhead from earlier following them. Seeing this, the class followed the trio. Once Kirishima made it to the two boys, he got their attention. You know, I think you both are pretty cool and strong. Izuku and Katsuki turned around and both had a raised brow. Seeing this, Kirishima continued, let's be friends. The two boys looked at one another and shrugged and nodded. Seeing this, Kirishima grinned and followed the two boys towards the changing room. Now we skip to the end of the school day. Izuku walked outside of his class and noticed Yui waiting for him, with a smile on her face. Katsuki, who was behind Izuku, patted him on his shoulder, and said I approve. He then walked away waving over his shoulder. Side note, he was also grounded like Izuku, just thought I had to put that in there. Anyways, back to the story. Izuku and Yui made their way out of UA, and Izuku texted his mom asking if it would be okay to go to the movies with Yui. Inko, seeing the text, grinned. She allowed it, but said to keep it PG, I don't want grandbabies yet. His mother already met Yui on multiple occasions and liked the black-haired girl. Seeing the text, Izuku's face went beet red again. Yui, who was looking on over his shoulder, blushed as well. She then grabbed his hand and intertwined their fingers. Both of them headed to the train station. She wanted to watch a horror movie and Izuku had agreed. Now we skip to the next day. If you want me to write more scenes for Yui and Izuku, let me know. Anyways, back to the story. Damn, I do that a lot. Anyways, again. It was now the end of the class and everyone was excited, because this would be their first heroics class. And all of the students were happy, hoping to try out their costumes. Oh, and Izuku's costume is a black high-collared sweater, with fingerless black and red gloves, and black combat pants with some medical stuff on his side, along with his one pouch for his trusted cough syrups. Yes, he has 3 of them in a pouch. Anyways, he has black combat boots on as well. Think of the outfit Toge wears in the original Jujutsu Kaisen anime. Anyways, all of the students heard wind rustling at the door, and said door quickly flew open with All Might walking in. Both Izuku and Katsuki looked at one another and gulped. I hope he isn't like his teacher, they both thought. Izuku and Katsuki had told Gran Torino about All Might and he said, oh Tashinori, I was the one who trained him. Now both boys were weary of the blonde muscle-headed hero. All Might saw the two boys' frightful expressions and sweat dropped. Do they really think I'm anything like sensei? As he thought of Gran Torino, he shivered. Quickly putting that on the back of his mind, he spoke while holding a sign out to the students. We are going to be doing battle trials. Everyone cheered at that, but Izuku and Katsuki stood quiet. With both of them thinking in their mind, third rule of Mr. Torino training, don't explain or question Torino's training. All the while having that on repeat. Then All Might looked at the two boys and both tensed up. He just grabbed a device and clicked the button. The wall besides them went down and showed briefcases. All Might then spoke, go get change and meet me at Training City Beta, and with it he left the room. Before anyone could get up, Izuku and Katsuki had grabbed their stuff and dashed towards the changing room. 5 minutes later, the two were now in front of an amused All Might. Both boys were leaning on one another trying to catch their breath. Said Hiro thought, I can get used to this. He coughed and noticed how both boys tensed and saluted. All Might had a sweat drop and thought, okay, how harsh did sensei train them? In another city, Gran Torino sneezed. He looked around and thought they better not be talking about my training. He was about to speak, but that's when everyone else appeared and All Might grinned at their costumes. Once the class was in front of him, he gestured towards the two black boxes behind him. We will be doing battle trials. Everyone go and grab a ball and whoever gets the same one is your teammates. This is going to be 2-on-2, with heroes and villains. He saw that Lita was about to raise his hand, but All Might spoke up. We have it random because we don't know who you will be teamed with when you become heroes when facing a villain. Lita slowly raised his hand down. Anyways, all of the teams are the same in canon, but Izuku and Katsuki are facing off last. All Might looked on at the two boys with their partners and told the villains to go inside the building first. Bakugou looked at Lita and grabbed the blue-haired boy's arm and dragged him inside the building. He then looked over at Achiko and Izuku. Alright, you two stand outside and wait for my signal to start. Both of them nodded and walked outside, waiting in front of the 5-story building. Achiko tried to ask Izuku if he had a plan, but said boy just shook his head in the negative. She just sighed and was going to come up with one herself, but that's when All Might's voice could be heard through the intercoms. Start! Izuku and the brown-haired girl ran inside and the green-haired boy pointed at a separate route. She just nodded and ran into that direction. Midoriya then looked towards the staircase in front of him and ran up it, doing so 2 more times till he bumped his head against Bakugou's. Said boy glared at the green-haired boy and shouted, "Watch where you're going, I'm looking for Izuku." Izuku shouted back. "Caviar, tuna tuna." Katsuki looked up and noticed Izuku, oh. And with that he launched an explosion at the green-haired boy. Said boy jumped back and unstrapped his collar. Side note, this collar instead of a zipper has a small black button that isn't noticeable, but instead of pulling down his collar he can just yank it to the side. Izuku shouted blast away. The blonde used an explosion and dodged to the side, now being in an open hallway. Izuku followed shortly after. The blonde stretched a bit with a grin and the green-haired boy did the same. You know, we always have fights, but it usually ends in a draw or it usually gets too destructive, then we have to stop. All Might hearing this had a feeling of a bad omen, and shouted into the speaker, keep collateral damage to a minimal or else both of you are disqualified. Izuku chuckled after hearing that, but Katsuki just growled. The blonde got into a stance and Izuku did the same, then after a second they both rushed at one another. Katsuki launched a roundhouse kick with an explosion towards Izuku, who dodged under said kick and shouted, "Get crushed!" Hearing this, Katsuki used an explosion and blasted himself into the air, dodging the attack. He then blasted his way down towards Izuku, explosion in hand. He then launched said explosion. But Izuku just shouted disperse and the explosion Katsuki had sent got sent to the side of Izuku. Not being deterred in the slightest, he let gravity do its thing and punched Izuku in the face. He used the explosion as a distraction to land a hit. But as he landed said hit, Izuku muttered, "Explode!" And an explosion launched Katsuki towards the end of the hall. He growled and pointed an accusing finger at him, "Don't use explosions against me." In response, Izuku just shrugged nonchalantly. Bakugou growled and noticed both of his gauntlets were charged. Izuku noticed Bakugou's gaze and shook his head in the negative, all the while doing a cross with his arms. Bakugou looked up and smirked, "Oh, I am doing this." Over the earpiece, All Might shouted, "Listen here Katsuki, if you don't stop you're disqualified from this test." But the blonde didn't care. He pointed a gauntlet at Izuku and grinned, "Let's see if you can redirect this." And with that he pulled the pin, which left a loud boom. Izuku, seeing the explosion, shouted redirect, however he didn't notice the second pin falling. Katsuki appeared on the side and launched another big explosion towards Izuku, who got hit, but the ash blonde didn't notice the one Izuku redirected being right in front of him. He looked to his side and muttered, "Oh sure." Boom. Both boys got launched outside of the building. Izuku was able to redirect the explosion at the last second towards the ground, but still felt the impact of said explosion. And the blonde had put his guard up at the last second as well, using his 2 gauntlets as a makeshift shield. So once the two landed outside, All Might could be heard over the intercoms. Katsuki, Bakugou and Izuku Midoriya are eliminated. After hearing this, Bakugou growled and Izuku sighed, wondering why he got in trouble. Probably because he redirected the explosion towards Bakugou, he thought. But during the big explosion Lita lost balance and Achiko was able to get the bomb while using her quirk. Anyways, that is the end of this part. If you enjoyed this part, leave a like and subscribe. Also tell me in the comments if you guys would want What If Deku was Spider-Man.